I would like now to open the feedback session from this morning's roundtable discussion by the members. Just to recap, Assembly members have spent the last 45 minutes brainstorming on the topics and issues they want to hear about over the remaining weekends that we consider the 8th Amendment. I would like now to call on the facilitators at each table to summarise the key topics which have emerged at each table. If necessary, we might ask the facilitators, when I say we, I probably mean myself and the Secretary. We might ask the facilitators to elaborate on any of the points raised, and if necessary, members themselves can join in the discussion. So to kick things off, I'm going to start at the bottom of the table. Table 14. Would the facilitator on table 14
Hi, thanks, Judge.
Tell us.
From our table, I think what emerged originally was we came from a position of just not knowing a lot about the legal basis, and so there was a lot of just wanting to know more about that. And also, I know they found the discussions yesterday very useful in terms of loading them with information, and they certainly like more of that in terms of concrete information. I think they found quite a lot of it quite abstract. So a lot of what they would be looking for now are far more concrete examples. Certainly hearing from pressure groups on both sides would be helpful. Perhaps hearing more about alternative solutions as well to broaden the discussion in terms of the safety or not of so-called abortion pills. More clarification on that would be helpful. Also, what came up was the idea of the fallout in terms of women who don't go through abortions, and in particular situations where foster care comes into it, and how much damage society sees in that. And they would like maybe some more information about that, perhaps from social workers might be helpful.
I think that's something we would have to give a lot of consideration to. I know the question of foster care was raised yesterday. I'm not so sure, and I'm just talking off the top of my head now, but I'm not so sure how relevant it is, but it's something we will definitely consider.
And one other thing that came up was the situation yesterday that was presented in terms of conscientious objections from GPs and medical professionals. And I know, Judge, you alluded to it yesterday in terms of regulatory guidelines.
Yes,
for
yes.
these people, and clarification on that would definitely be welcome.
Yes, we will definitely pursue that.
Great. Yes, and also they would also like to hear from not so much the medical professionals that are happy enough with the legislative framework, but from those doctors that would perhaps want more in terms of a legal framework. Those doctors who are asking for that framework, they would like to hear from them as well.
Yes, thank you very much.
Right.
That's very helpful. Table 13 now, I think.
At our table, we were asking to maybe hear from multicultural groups, and if we could hear from people who have had personal experience.
Yes.
And another point that was made at the table was that maybe that they could get that the citizens could get the papers a little bit earlier. That
Yes,
they didn't have time to read them.
Yes. Yeah.
In future weekends we will definitely give you the papers earlier. It was a conscious decision that we made for various reasons, just because we felt that the burden on you coming here and so on for the first weekend, that was enough to be sort of getting on with, but definitely we will be giving you the papers in advance in future.
Yeah.
Okay, and another point that was made was that maybe that we could hear more from female GPs and maybe from GPs from disadvantaged areas. And if we could hear from abortion experts from the UK and other countries. And from adoption agencies. And an overview about how it all works.
An overview of?
Abortion in other countries.
Oh, yes,
I
yes.
think that we are dominated by the UK naturally, because most
Yes.
women go to the UK.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's table 13.
Yeah.
And yet there is debates around the world on abortion. Not all countries offer abortion, but a lot of countries have had debates.
Yeah.
And we'd be interested in hearing what the universal arguments, what's raging around the world on abortion, not alone in Ireland, obviously, but everywhere else.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes. And of course, there is also the question of what is the regime in other countries, as distinct of the raging about it, what it is, what the regime is. Yeah, very good. Is that all, table 13? That's very, very helpful. I'll go to table 12 now.
Thank you. There's a number of topics. Number one was the group would like to hear from people who have had first-hand experiences of this, of abortion, women who have experienced abortion and have a more positive viewpoint, and in the interest of balance as well, women who have a negative viewpoint of abortions, but first-hand experience. Also, the group is interested in hearing someone who can speak towards the rights of a child, but there is an awareness that there may be a difficulty towards that, or ascertaining who could even speak as to the rights of a child or the child's perspective. With regards to another topic, which was the direct first-hand experience of professionals who've worked with aftercare and before care for abortions, and professionals who have operated with direct experience of abortions themselves and could give, they were looking for people who weren't professional spokespeople but had direct experience themselves. Also, there was a desire to hear about the consequences of repealing the Eighth Amendment, the legislative and constitutional effects of doing that would be. And two other points were representations from the weakest members of society, people who would less likely speak for themselves. So they're referring to people with drug addiction problems, the travelling community, charity groups. And finally, there was a desire to hear from an international perspective in relation to European Courts of Human Rights cases and UN, and
Yes.
viewpoint from the UN.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much. Table 11 now.
Our group would like to hear more about the conflict between ethics and the legal system in this. And we wondered if it's possible to get anonymous submissions from women who have gone through this and have travelled. We'd also like to hear more from counsellors and GPs who have experience of women who have been through the process of travelling, who followed up with counselling and support when they came back, and the effect that it's had on them. We'd like a balanced view from advocacy groups. We'd like to look at the...
Sorry, can I just ask you just to slow down a little bit, bearing in mind that we have the translation going on. Thank you.
We'd like to hear more on medical ethics and the right to live and the right to die. And we'd like to hear more about the conclusions of IVF, if it's in vitro, why it's not considered a termination, but if it's in utero, it is. We'd like to hear more about cases of fatal fetal abnormality.
Yes.
We'd like to hear from someone from the Rape Crisis Centre. And we'd like to hear from someone from a UK clinic who deals with abortion and has experience of dealing with Irish women travelling over. We'd like to understand what the options are for changes to the Constitution and to the 8th, and how it would work, and the time frame.
What do you mean by time frame?
If there were to be changes, how long it would all take.
Oh, I
to
see
take
what you mean,
place.
yeah. I think that's very much out of our hands.
And then just the other thing was, there was a suggestion from our table of how the workshops could work, or the talks. We'd like to hear from the medical side first, and then the legal side, but if the Q&A could be together. And that's us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're on to table 10 now, I think.
Thank you very much, Judge. The first point from table 10 is about a clarification of the process or the journey from the presentations through to the roundtable discussion, the question and answer session, and then a final report. What happens in that intervening space that translates the citizen's voice into the recommendations at the final report. In relation to topics, the group would like to see a revisit of the topic of ethics, ideally in the same weekend as the issue, and I think you've already committed to come back to it, the fatal fetal abnormality issue.
Oh, yeah.
So the group had suggested that ideally that would happen at the next weekend, and that the ethics session might be on the Sunday morning. There was also a request, and this could be anonymised technically, I believe, but would it be possible to hear from some woman who has been through an abortion? The suggestion for the third weekend is that you would have non-denominational pro-life representation, and you would also have pro-choice representation. And also on that weekend that, for example, a frontline social worker who deals with the most vulnerable groups in our society in this topic area, such as people in direct provision, refugees, sex workers and people from the private areas. We recognise that that's casting a net very wide, but if there was a mechanism to come up with a social worker, frontline rather than head office based, to address the group with the real issues on the ground. On the legal issues, and it has been raised by somebody else, it would be useful to have a look at the regimes prevailing in other jurisdictions, and you have mentioned that yourself.
Yes,
thank you.
yes.
And the final point was more administrative. There was a feeling it would be helpful if the question and answer sessions were longer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So now we're moving to the table 9.
Yes, table 9, and I should say some themes are emerging because many of the things that have been said already came out in our table.
Yes.
And one, just to address process, our table was unanimous in its praise of the format of the experts, then the group discussion, and then the Q&A, so nobody has any suggestions to improve that.
Yeah.
Also echoing something that was previously said, our table would like guidance from the committee that's to receive the recommendations as to what sort, not obviously what recommendations they want, but what type of thing that they want. to receive from this body.
Are you saying you'd like to hear from the Oireachtas Committee? Or
Yeah, there was a question at our table. It was what is going to be the product of what type of in what sort of format is to be the product of this body.
All right, but that I think is a matter for all of us. We have to interpret what the job we've been given by the Oireachtas, by the use of the expression, the Eighth Amendment, and how we approach it. But we will be dealing with that, and you will all be involved in it.
Very good.
Yeah.
And our table recognised that there are going to be strong opposing views and partisan views on this particular topic, and they expressed a view that it might be good to get them out of the way next week to have the very, very divisive debate heard early in the 4 weekends that we have to discuss this topic. And a view was also expressed that our table would like to hear from people from those partisan sides who aren't lawyers, because the feeling is that in general this debate seems to be is very legalistic, and they would prefer non-lawyers to contribute in that. And it was this table would like to hear specifically about younger women, the experiences of younger women, school age and college age. So we'd be talking probably from teens to about age 23. And this table agrees that they want to hear about comparative regimes in other countries and the experience of other countries. And this table would like an ethics expert to be brought back in to give a view on the issues that are raised about the issue of terminations following in utero diagnosis of genetic conditions such as Down syndrome. Oh, actually, just one last thing. This table would also like to have medical and legal experts available on panel at the same time to prevent questions being ruled out as being misdirected. And thank you.
Yeah. Yes, now table 8.
Good afternoon. Table 8 would like to have representatives from youth organisations and welfare officers from student unions give their views. Also representative group again from the ICGP to give their opinion on the way forward regarding contraception. They'd also asked for religious groups represented in Ireland to give their opinions. Community groups as well from disadvantaged areas around the country. And finally, representatives from medical or scientific groups to discuss medical advances regarding the possibility of full-term test tube births. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hello, on behalf of Table 7, yes, there's a lot of overlap with topics that have been raised by other tables.
Yes.
First, a constitutional expert who would be free to talk about the ramifications of change in the Irish legal system. Then an overview of the system in such countries as the UK or Netherlands, both from a legal and a medical perspective, the status quo, how that works. Then perhaps Irish doctors or medical practitioners who could talk about what would be needed as regards training to allow for a broader remit for abortion in Ireland from a medical training perspective. Then, as other tables have suggested, pro-life and pro-choice bodies. Also, perhaps a sociologist who could talk about the particular Irish social context of any the present situation, how it got there, and ramifications for change.
It was also suggested possibly some form of men's group as to whether or not males should have a voice in the decision-making process in respect of abortion. And then we also wondered whether it would be possible to have a broad overview of the submissions that you have received, and those are our suggestions.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
The date for filing submissions, final date is the 16th of December, so it would be after that. Yeah. Thank you very much. So we're going to table 6 now, I think.
Table 6. We had a lot of overlap as well. We were interested in having speakers from interest groups for pro-life and pro-choice as well. Informed opinions, but not necessarily professionals. We wanted to hear from a medical representative in the UK. I believe that was already expressed a few times. We wanted to hear something on fathers' rights.
Yes.
In this equation. We wanted to get statistics on fatal abnormalities. Once again, that was already mentioned. A representative from equal rights groups. And let's see here. We wanted to hear about physicians who are not satisfied with the process. And we wanted to hear about the options and consequences of those options available to facilitate change. And we wanted to know the funding specialists to inform us on what funding is behind each lobby group on both sides.
Sorry, would you mind repeating that?
Sure. What funding was behind each lobby group on both sides. And that's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think it's table 5, isn't it?
Again, there was a lot of overlap in respect of some of the topics.
We anticipated that.
The balance of our issues would be, firstly, perhaps a policymaker in the educational system, for example, to see what the view is in respect of sex education with minors. Also, a representative from for the voice of people in direct provision. And also a representative from an NGO that would specialise in Children's Rights Alliance, or maybe EPIC, to voice, to have a voice in respect of children who may become pregnant and are faced with having to make a decision. And just in respect of the format, our table is very happy with how it's being run. Just in respect of panel discussions, they have also suggested that professionals, i.e. medical or legal, are on the panel at the same time. And the rest of our topics have already been aired.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, table 4.
Thank you, Judge. Again, many of the comments have already been raised, but I'll just go through them to ensure we cover them all. In terms of issues, perspectives, fetal abnormality. Next will be human rights perspective. Next will be what happens internationally. Next will be, can we hear from people who are critical of the 8th Amendment? Then the suggestion in relation to a theological perspective. Also, in terms of personal experiences of those who've had an abortion. Then issues and clarification on the protection for the unborn, timelines for viability and definition. Next is the political perspective. And overall, in terms of the issues perspective, is what happens if the 8th Amendment is repealed, the constitutional and legislative impact. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
From politicians.
But is the topic you wish a politician to address the consequences of repeal? Or is that a separate issue?
It's a separate issue.
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood you. I
No,
just want, yeah.
It's to hear the political parties' viewpoint on this.
Yeah, all right, yeah. And then as a separate issue, the consequences of repeal.
Correct.
And its implications.
Correct. In relation to who to present on those perspectives, issues, there was a request for more gender balance.
Yeah.
For the female perspective to be presented from a female law expert or a female doctor.
Yeah.
And also a human rights expert. For representatives from the pro-life, pro-choice groups.
Yeah.
And the comment was we would like to hear both sides, but to avoid polarisation. We've already mentioned those who've had an abortion and their experiences. A presentation from abortion clinics and experts elsewhere. And some names were mentioned during the course of the discussion, which we've taken a note of. And overall, the table wishes to compliment the speakers over the weekend and the organisation. And the one suggestion would be to have the legal and medical experts on at the same time for question and answer.
Yeah, very good. All right, then we're going to table 3 now.
Thank you, Judge. From this table, there's a great, if you like, similarity between the aspects that we seem to be discussing as well. The first one there that I've got down is the legal and medical experts, which we all agree should be sitting at the table to answer these questions at the same time, to avoid any confusion. One of the other aspects that we came up with here was the more modern aspect in regard to genetic, if you like, screening of embryos at a very early stage. And it turns out that apparently in Iceland, no Down syndrome children have been born in the last 4 years, apparently. And this has caused a bit of an issue here. So we would like potentially an expert who is a genetic individual who can obviously talk about that and fetal abnormalities, which also is a major issue here as well. We agree with the other tables that have talked about pre and post abortion counselling, and somebody from that regard would be very helpful as well. And also in regard to the legal aspect into the Constitution, it was felt at one point that Article 43, which talks about the right to life of the unborn in the first sentence, maybe could be changed to the right of the life of the mother, and then with due regard to the equal rights of the unborn. So it was kind of felt here that maybe the emphasis was an opinion of this table, obviously, that the rights, the mother should come first and the rights of the unborn should come second. Now, again, that would be an amendment to the Constitution. So it would be useful if we had a constitutional expert to give a view on that.
I think the rationalisation of that is that the right to life of an individual is preserved,
absolutely
protected in Article 40. So that may be the reasoning that is put in those terms.
It's put in that term, exactly. It's just, it was an interesting slant on the conversation here, Judge. So thank you for that. I'd like to compliment as well the Secretariat and the speakers for the weekend. Very interesting. Thank you.
Yes, now we're moving to Table 2. Yes.
Thank you, Judge. Table 2. There was an agreement at Table 2 that we would like to hear from someone from the Rape Crisis Centre. The head of the Rape Crisis Centre's name, Nolene Blackwell, was brought up, but it was felt that the issue of crisis abortions that arise due to the issue of rape deserve a special consideration.
Yes.
We would also like someone who could speak further on the types of information available to women with crisis pregnancies and the legitimacy of the information available and or the need for regulation. And that was also felt very important. We spoke also about the types of groups that we would like to hear from on the pro-life and pro-choice sides. It was felt that the Catholic Church have a very large representation, and it would be helpful to hear from them. Other right-to-life groups, including the Iona Institute, perhaps. For the pro-choice side, women's rights groups would be particularly welcome, and also it was felt that the repeal, the eighth side, have made a lot of noise, and we'd like to hear from them too. A particular, I think, an issue that we might have heard from one of the other tables, but we felt very strongly would be helpful, was someone to address the Assembly from the clinics in England on the types of abortions that they're seeing, the specific issues, abortion, why people are getting abortions, for instance, Down syndrome, fatal fetal abnormality, and any other issues. And perhaps they might be able to add some light onto statistics of Irish women using their services, and also what kind of other services they might offer, either pre or post-abortion, for instance, counselling, and what kind of day-to-day activity they go through that might help us consider the issue further. There was also a comment regarding receiving the papers in advance, and I appreciate that's been answered.
Yeah, that's not a problem anymore.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we would also like to see to have the ability to have legal advice after we hear from the various interest groups and at other stages of the Assembly, so that that can be considered, the issues discussed can be considered, and the implications of any proposals we may have can also be fully considered. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then table one.
Good afternoon. We have 7 points. The first is we'd be anxious that all views be represented. So rather than essentially the entire spectrum of views, so rather than the more extreme speakers perhaps dominating it, that speakers from all along the spectrum between yes and no might be invited. We're very happy with how the information is being presented at the moment. The idea of having the speakers and then being allowed to discuss it, rather than be front-loaded with a lot of speakers, we would prefer if that was kept, that we have 1 or 2 speakers and then discuss it and clarify matters as we go along. We'd also like another opportunity for feedback at some point, much like this session, just so that when we've heard more information, then that, again, it could be redirected at another point once the citizens are more informed again from further speeches.
Well, you can be assured that that will be kept constantly under review. I mean, yeah.
We would also be looking for a little more expert evidence. In terms of medical expert evidence, we'd like to see more about the development of the fetus, exactly how that happens as it goes along. For instance, when it first feels pain, essentially step by step how a fetus would develop over time. We'd also similarly like to hear expert evidence on the precise mechanisms of abortion, as in the different ways of doing it, at what times different treatments become preferable. We'd also, in terms of law, we'd have 2 things we'd like to know. One has been mentioned already, father's rights, the legal position, the father's right to perhaps object. And there is another matter we were curious about, is at what stage under the law is a miscarriage, does it become a dead child versus a miscarriage? So say the issue of birth certificates, death certificates, coroner's investigations. Essentially, why in Irish law is a child considered unborn versus a baby at different points along the pregnancy spectrum? What is the rationale for that, and perhaps the different points in law at which a pregnancy is treated differently aside from the issue of abortion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very good. That's extremely helpful, and we have been obviously thinking about this. We've been thinking of it over almost 3 months now, I think, and the Secretary will outline the way we're thinking as of now, but our thinking as of now is going to be absolutely influenced by what we've heard here this evening, or this morning.